Okay, so you're going to Mount Rainier, huh? Specifically Paradise, and you want to bring your camera, right?
Sounds ambitious.
Oh, it is. But they want more than just like the typical touristy snapshots. This listener wants to capture, I think, the feeling of the place, like the essence of Mount Rainier.
Ah, I see, a soul searcher. That's awesome. And they sent in a podcast, right? About photographing paradise?
Yeah, plus some notes. So clearly they're serious about this, which I love. So using that podcast and the notes, let's give them a deep dive, all the info they need to totally rock this photography trip.
All right, let's do it. Good call sending in that podcast, by the way. I listened to it, and those hosts, they get it. They understand how important light is at paradise. Like they were talking about golden hour and reflections at Tipsu Lake. It's clear they know that light can make or break a shot, especially somewhere like Mount Rainier, where conditions change constantly.
Absolutely. It's like if you don't understand the light, you're missing half the story, Before we go any further, though, let's make sure we're on the same page here. What exactly is golden hour? I mean, I hear photographers throw that term around all the time, but...
Right. Okay. So golden hour basically refers to the hour after sunrise and the hour before sunset. The sun's low in the sky at those times, and that creates a warm, diffused light. It's much softer than that harsh midday sun.
So less squinting at the sun, more soft and dreamy kind of vibe.
Yeah, exactly. Midday sun, that's when you get those super bright highlights and dark shadows. Things get kind of blown out. Golden hour. Way more flattering for landscapes for sure.
Okay, so less ouch, my eyes more, beautiful, got it. But how does that actually translate to a better photo? I mean, especially when we're talking about Mount Rainier, what should people be looking for?
Well, think about the Paradise landscape. You've got those huge sweeping vistas, right? Wildflower meadows, these rugged peaks, golden hour light. It makes those textures really stand out. Colors look amazing. Shadows get all long and dramatic.
Adds depth, basically, like a whole other dimension.
Yeah, exactly. You just don't get that same effect in the middle of the day.
Gotcha. So golden hour is like nature's Instagram filter, basically. The podcast mentioned a few trails, so let's walk through those, see how this golden hour magic works with each one. They started with the Skyline Trail.
Oh, yeah, Skyline Trail, 5.5 miles, panoramic views. That was perfect for golden hour. Imagine meadows bathed in warm light, and then bam, the mountain glowing in the background.
All right, I'm picturing it. It's gorgeous. But practically speaking, you're there. You've got your camera. What should you be doing to capture that?
Okay, so first, scout the location the day before. Figure out where that light's going to fall at sunrise or sunset. And then arrive early, give yourself time, set up your tripod because stability is key, especially when you're dealing with low light. And be patient.
No rushing the masterpiece.
Exactly. Light changes so fast during golden hour, like minute by minute. You got to be ready to adapt, adjust your composition as you go.
So it's not just about sunset, click. It's about planning ahead and being in tune with what that light is doing.
Exactly. It's a dance,
Love that. Okay, what about the Neches Peak Loop Trail? That one's shorter, right? Like 3.2 miles?
Yep. And it's known for its wildflowers and those amazing reflections of Rainier in Tipsu Lake.
Oh, yeah. I've seen pictures. Dreamy.
Right. And golden hour just takes it to a whole other level. That mountain's reflection just shimmering in the water, and you've got wildflowers catching the last bits of light. It's like
the mountain admiring itself in the mirror with this incredible light show happening.
Yes, exactly.
That's an image that captures the essence of paradise for sure. Speaking of different perspectives, the podcast also talked about the Pinnacle Peak Trail.
Yeah, Pinnacle Peak, that one's shorter, 2.5 miles, but steeper. What's unique about it is the view. You get Mount Rainier and the Tattoos Range. It's about seeing the vastness of the whole landscape.
Oh, wow. So even though it's a tougher hike, you get this wider context. It's like each trail offers a different story, a different mood. But we got to get practical too, right? What about the gear? From the notes that this listener uses a Sony, right, as their main camera, but they carry a Nikon as backup.
Yeah, that's a smart move. Always good to have a backup. But honestly, more important than any specific brand is understanding why certain gear is so crucial when you're photographing Mount Rainier.
It's about having the right tools for the job. Makes sense. So what did they say about the must-haves?
The tripod was number one. Absolutely vital for low-light shooting during golden hour, especially if you want to use slower shutter speeds to get those dreamy landscapes. And they were big on wide-angle lenses, too.
Which makes sense. You're trying to capture those epic views.
Right. And a lot of people think, oh, I'll just zoom out. But zooming out can actually reduce the image quality, especially if you're not using a high-end lens. A good wide-angle lens is designed to capture those sweeping vistas without distortion, super sharp, even at the edges.
So it's about quality over convenience in this case.
Exactly.
What other gear stood out to you?
They mentioned a polarizing filter. That's a total game changer for landscapes. Mount Rainier's volcanic rock, it reflects light in a very specific way, and a polarizer helps control that glare. It makes the blues in the sky deeper, the colors just pop.
So you're taking an already amazing scene and then just like dialing up the saturation, the clarity.
Yeah, basically, it makes the image so much more impactful. Plus, filters protect your lens from all the dust and scratches, especially important in a place like Mount Rainier.
Makes sense. So we've got the camera, the tripod, the wide-angle lens, the polarizing filter. Anything else?
Oh, for sure. Extra batteries, memory cards. You don't want to run out of juice at the worst possible moment, right? Especially in the cold, batteries can drain super fast. And of course, you'll need a good backpack to carry all that gear.
It's like a balancing act, capturing the beauty, but also being prepared for the practical challenges of being out in nature. Speaking of which, we got to talk timing, because the podcast host said timing is everything when it comes to Mount Rainier photography.
They're not wrong. Light's always changing. And each season, even each time of day, it's like the mountain's wearing a different outfit, They talked about how wildflowers are at their peak, July, August. But even then, Mother Nature doesn't always follow the calendar perfectly.
So checking conditions is key. Don't just assume because it's August, boom, wildflowers everywhere.
Right. Flexibility is your friend. And they were smart to mention winter photography, too. They said winter turns paradise into this snowy wonderland, which sounds incredible, but obviously comes with its own challenges.
Like, I'm guessing flip-flops are not the recommended footwear?
No, not quite. You need to be ready for snow, ice, maybe even closed trails, warm layers, waterproof boots, maybe even some microspikes for traction. And yeah, those batteries bring extras, always.
Okay, so winter photography at Paradise is for the truly dedicated, huh?
It's its own unique adventure. But whether you go in summer or winter, the key is to be adaptable. Like embrace that the mountain's always changing. It's part of the beauty.
Totally. And that brings us to a really important point that the podcast hosts made. Respecting the mountain. Stay on the trails, not just for your own safety, but to protect the environment too.
Right. They were all about leave no trace. It's more than just picking up your trash. It's about minimizing your impact. Think before you step.
So what does that look like for a photographer specifically?
It means staying on the trail even if you see a perfect shot off to the side. Packing out everything you pack in, even those tiny little wrappers. And being mindful of the wildlife.
Right. Observe them from a distance, but don't mess with their natural behavior just to get that Instagram-worthy pics.
Exactly. We're guests in this space, not, conquerors. And the podcast host made a 4-point. A photograph can actually be a tool for conservation. By showing how beautiful this place is, you can inspire people to care about it, protect it.
That's such a cool way to think about it. It's not just about taking pretty pictures. It's about sharing that beauty responsibly, and using your art to advocate for the environment.
Exactly. And it all comes back to capturing the essence of Mount Rainier. Not just what it looks like, but what it feels like to be there. The spirit of the place.
Right, like its fragility, its importance. Okay, we've covered a lot here. Trails, golden hour, gear, respecting the environment.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface. Like, we haven't even touched on composition or storytelling or, the challenges and rewards of night photography. That's a whole other beast.
Which, luckily for us, we've got plenty of time to dive into. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore how to use your camera to tell stories about Mount Rainier, and then how to capture those amazing night shots, Milky Way over the peak, the whole 9 yards. We'll be right back.
It's funny, we often think about our senses as separate things, but they all work together, right, to shape how we experience the world.
Oh, totally. Like, smell a batch of fresh-baked cookies, and suddenly you're 8 years old again at your grandma's house.
Exactly. And I think it's the same with photography. Like, the podcast host barely touched on this, but by tuning into the sounds of Mount Rainier, you can add so much depth to your images, even though the viewer won't literally hear them.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So we've talked about sight, obviously, but now we're bringing in sound. How does listening make you a better photographer, especially at a place like Mount Rainier?
Well, think about it. What do you hear at Paradise? I mean, really hear? The wind, maybe whistling through the trees, or the roar of a waterfall, maybe even that crunch of snow under your boots. All those sounds evoke emotions, don't they? They create a mood.
So it's like, instead of just seeing a waterfall, I'm hearing its power, feeling the mist on my face. And that changes how I think about the shot, what I want to convey.
Exactly. Like, maybe that roar makes you want to use a slower shutter speed, so you get that blood water effect, that sense of movement. Or maybe you focus on the stillness of the forest around the waterfall, so you get this amazing contrast.
Like, the soundscape is giving you these clues on how to tell the story visually. I like that. What other sounds at Paradise could influence a photographer?
Well, the wind's a big one, like howling wind. That might inspire you to capture the feeling of being exposed on a ridge, maybe using black and white, a dramatic composition. But if it's calm and peaceful, you might want to focus on a quiet meadow, using soft light and colors.
Man, this is making me rethink my whole approach to photography. It's not just what you see, it's about feeling the wind, hearing the sounds, letting that all inform how you capture the essence of the place, which I guess goes back to what the podcast host said about capturing a new story with your lens. But how do you do that at a place as iconic as Mount Rainier? We've all seen those classic shots, you know?
It's easy to fall into that trap. But I think it comes down to remembering that Mount Rainier is more than just this static mountain. It's a whole ecosystem that's constantly changing, the weather, the seasons, even the time of day. And that change, that's the story.
So maybe instead of just shooting those grand vistas, you zoom in, look for those smaller details that show how things are changing.
Exactly, like the patterns of froth on a leaf, or the way the light filters through the branches. Those little things tell a story about the life force of the mountain.
It's finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. I like that. Any other tips for finding a fresh perspectives?
Don't be afraid to play around with angles, get low to the ground, shoot upwards to the wildflowers, climb a ridge for a bird's eye view, play with light and shadow, depth of field.
Break the rules, basically.
Well, within reason. But yeah, push yourself creatively. You're not just documenting the mountain, you're having a conversation with it through your lens.
I love that. A conversation. Okay, but let's be real. Not everyone has weeks to spend exploring, right? What if you only have a day or two at Paradise? How do you even start to make the most of that time?
The podcast was right to emphasize planning. Know what you want to capture. Research the trails. Check weather forecasts. Use an app like the photographer's ephemeris to see where the light's going to fall at different times.
So you can maximize those precious few hours you have.
Exactly.
But how do you even decide what to focus on? I mean, it can feel overwhelming.
Pick a theme. What draws you to Mount Rainier? Are you into the contrast between the mountain's ruggedness and, the delicate beauty of wildflowers? Then maybe spend your time on trails like the Natchez Peak Loop. Look for compositions that highlight that duality.
So even with limited time, you can tell a focused story.
Nice. Okay, let's switch gears a little. We've talked a lot about the artistic side, but let's get practical again. The podcast host, I remember they were using a Sony and a Nikon, really emphasized the importance of having a backup. Yeah, that's just smart, especially Mount Rainier. Weather can change in an instant. Imagine you're about to capture those epic storm clouds rolling in and bam, your camera dies.
Oof. Backup is your best friend. Noted. They were also big on having a sturdy tripod. For someone new to this, why is that so important?
Think about those long exposure shots like waterfalls. You want that silky smooth water effect. You need a slow shutter speed, which means the camera can't move at all. Even the slightest shake will blur the image.
Right, because the shutter's open longer, it's taking in all that movement. Makes sense. So tripod's non-negotiable. What about lenses? They talked a lot about wide angle, but is that the only one you need?
Wide angle's great for landscapes, for sure. But you might also want a telephoto lens that lets you isolate details, compress the perspective, or capture wildlife from a safe distance.
So it's like having a super zoom, but without sacrificing quality.
Exactly. You could get those shots of mountain goats way up on the cliffs, or zoom in on a single wildflower with the mountain as a backdrop. It's pretty versatile.
Okay, so different lens for different story. What about filters? They mentioned the polarizing filter, but they didn't go into too much detail.
A polarizer is essential, especially when you're dealing with water or snow. It helps control those reflections and glare, makes the blues in the sky richer, the greens more vibrant, that kind of thing.
So it's not just protecting your lens, it's actually enhancing the whole scene. Okay, starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
That's the fun part.
Totally. And of course, all the practical stuff like lens cloths, a rain cover, headlamp, those are important too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Don't want to be fumbling around in the dark.
Speaking of challenging condition, the podcast host talked about how winter photography, well, it just requires a whole different mindset.
Yeah, they were right to emphasize that. Winter at Paradise is beautiful, but you got to be prepared. Dress warm, pack extra batteries, and know that some trails might be closed because of the snow.
And I imagine the light is totally different too. It's not just about bundling up.
Exactly. The light's often much softer, more diffused. You might need to adjust your settings, maybe use a slower shutter speed because there's less light overall. And keep an eye out for those moments when the sun breaks through the clouds, that light on the snow. It's magic.
Sounds like it. So winter photography is all about embracing the elements, being flexible.
And finding beauty in unexpected places.
Love that. Okay, we've talked about gear, the technical stuff, the artistic considerations, but there's something else we haven't really addressed yet.
You're talking about the ethical side of photography, right?
Right. The podcast was really clear about respecting the environment, staying on trails, but what else should photographers be thinking about?
Well, it's not just about the environment, it's about respecting other visitors, too. Don't block the trails with your tripod. Be mindful of noise levels. Remember that everyone's there to enjoy the mountain.
Common sense and courtesy go a long way. And when it comes to wildlife, I remember they emphasized observation over interaction.
Yeah, never approach or feed wildlife. Use a telephoto lens to get those shots from a distance, and just be aware of their behavior. If they seem agitated, give them space.
Right. Be a respectful observer, not someone who's disrupting their home just to get a photo.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Trails, gear, ethics, even the sounds of the mountain.
And we haven't even touched on night photography.
Which is exactly where we're headed next. In part 3, we're going to deep dive into how to capture the Milky Way over Mount Rainier. Get ready to do some stargazing. Okay, so we're back and I am pumped. Time to tackle the final frontier of Mount Rainier photography.
Right. Capturing the night sky. I gotta be honest, this is the part I'm most excited about, but also, like, the most intimidated by.
Oh yeah, I get it. Night photography, it's a whole different world. But when you get it right, it's so rewarding. Just imagine capturing the Milky Way, arcing over that mountain peak.
Okay, now I'm getting chills. But before we get all lost in the stars, let's break it down. What are the biggest differences, really, between daytime and nighttime photography? Besides the obvious, I mean.
Well, the most obvious is light, right? Or the lack of it. You're working with such low light levels. It's crazy, which means longer exposures, higher ISO, and yeah, a bunch of new challenges you got to be ready for.
Right, because we can't just, like, ask the stars to shine brighter or something. So how do we make up for that lack of light? I mean, without ending up with a photo that's all grainy and noisy.
That's where all those camera settings come in. The aperture, shutter speed, ISO, they all work together to control how much light actually hits the sensor. So at night, you got to open up that aperture wide, use a slower shutter speed, and bump up that ISO.
Okay, so let's make sure I'm following you here. Aperture, that's the size of the opening in the lens, right? So wider means more light. Shutter speed, that's how long the shutter stays open, like how long it's capturing light. And ISO, that's how sensitive the sensor is to light. Did I get all that right?
Nailed it. And the trick is finding that sweet spot between all those settings. Because, if your shutter speed's too long, the stars will start to blur because the Earth's rotating. And if your ISO's too high, well, that's where you get that noise in the image.
So it's a balancing act. Got to get enough light, but not mess up the quality. Man, this is making my head spin a little.
Don't worry, it gets easier, I promise. Practice makes perfect. And the podcast host had some good tips. Remember how they were all about the tripod?
Yeah.
It's even more crucial for night photography. We're talking exposures of seconds, sometimes even minutes. Any little movement and your shot's ruined.
Right. Okay, so tripod, check. What else did they say about gear?
Definitely a wide-angle lens. That's a must if you want to capture those big, expansive night skies. And they mentioned a remote shutter release, too. It's helpful for avoiding camera shake when you're, actually taking the picture.
Oh, so no more, like, pressing the button with your fingers and potentially messing it up. Makes sense. Anything else in terms of night photography must-haves?
Headlamp, always. You need that to see what you're doing, adjust settings in the dark. And extra batteries, of course, long exposures, they just eat up battery power.
Gotcha. So we got the gear, we're starting to understand the settings, we're ready to go out under the stars. But, like, where do we even start? How do you choose the right location at Paradise for this kind of photography?
The podcast host talked about light pollution. That's the big thing, right? You got to find a spot where there's as little of that as possible. Get away from the city lights, car headlights, all that. Otherwise, the stars just get washed out.
So no setting up shop in the parking lot. Got it. Are there, like, specific spots at Paradise that people know are good for this?
They mentioned reflection lakes. Just picture it, the Milky Way reflecting in the water with Mount Rainier rising up in the background.
Okay, that's epic. But how do you actually find the Milky Way? It's not like it's always just hanging out in the same spot, right?
Nope, definitely not. You got to think about time of year, moon phase. There are apps for that too. Star Walk 2, Photo Pills. Those can help you figure out where to look.
So it's like planning a stargazing party, basically.
Pretty much.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. I'm picturing it, but how do we actually compose the shot? Any tips for framing those night sky photos?
They said foreground elements are key. It's about adding depth and interest, like frame Milky Way with some trees or a rock formation. Even your tent, if you're camping, that could look cool.
So it's not just about pointing the camera straight up. It's about making the whole picture interesting, telling a story. What about focusing? That's got to be hard in the dark.
Yeah, it can be. They suggested manually focusing, on a bright star or something, and use the live view mode on your camera. That way you can zoom in and really fine-tune it.
Okay, so manual focus, live view, zoom. Got it. Anything else to keep in mind when we're out there shooting the stars over Paradise?
Be patient. It takes time to get it right. Find the right spot, dial in those settings, wait for the perfect moment, and don't be afraid to experiment. That's the beauty of night photography. It's all about trial and error, pushing your creative boundaries.
This has been amazing. I mean, we've gone from, like, basic camera stuff to capturing the Milky Way over Mount Rainier. It's a lot, but it's also just the beginning, isn't it?
Totally. Photography, it's a journey, You never stop learning. And Mount Rainier, well, it's the perfect place to start.
It really is. So to everyone listening, all you aspiring photographers out there, remember to embrace the challenge, respect that mountain, and never stop exploring, right?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Then most importantly, have fun out there. Happy shooting, everyone. We'll catch you next time.